Right. And the last thing I want to ask you about is because you say you had a background in psychology and you work with animal liberation. Um, It'd be interesting to address the issue of how people perceive different animals, and maybe if you could talk a little bit about what you've learned or experienced with that, and um, maybe help us to like give us some pointers of uh, how we could open our minds to another perspective.
Okay, I think the first part will be easier to answer than the second part. So yeah, so actually the way that I've sort of organized what we do and how we do it with Seed the Commons has been very linked to having been a vegan for a long time and having studied psychology and sort of having reflected on why people stop being vegan, including myself. For a period of about a year, in my early 20s, I stopped being vegan. I mean, during the course of that year, I had dairy products maybe less than 10 times and no meat. So it wasn't like I went full on, but you know, so that was sort of the reflection. And you know, within this sort of local food movement and, you know, grazing and all that, there are a lot of people who are ex-vegetarians and ex-vegans. And so I think that the my experience with Seed the Commons, like we did a forum for 3 years. We're not doing it anymore. It was just difficult to sort of get support. So my experience talking about these issues with vegans, you know, saying we need to sort of build up veganic farmers because the food movement is sort of a force against animal liberation, all that, has been either that because they're not part of that movement, they don't really see it, and so they don't really believe what's going on. But the other response is usually, well, I need to find all the arguments that counter what somebody is saying in regards to protein, in regards to calcium, in regards to paleo being more healthy, in regards to grazing being better, et cetera, et cetera. And so we tend to, you know, want to sort of arm ourselves with all the arguments and say veganism is better for the environment and for social justice and, you know, for all the reasons. But my thought about it has been that ultimately the problem fundamentally is that we always see farm animals as a category onto themselves and animals that are always potentially food. And so a lot of people who went vegan or vegetarian and then who went back, yes, you can look at the individual cases and say, well, in this case, the person read something about the paleo diet being healthier, and so is because of the paleo fat. And then in this case, the person read something about local food being, you know, more sustainable, and that was it. But the underlying factor, in my opinion, in all of these cases, was that even as they were vegan for maybe 2 years, they didn't actually see cows and dogs as the same. They didn't see them as, you know, just as worthy of empathy and just not food. You know, fundamentally, when we talk about, you know, oh, well, I don't care what people eat or this or that, it's because we always potentially see cows and pigs and chickens as food. Like maybe it's food we're not eating. Perhaps for 2 years, perhaps for our lives, it's not food that we're eating, but it is food. Whereas dogs and cats are just not in our culture seen as food. And so it's an entirely different type of empathy, and it's an entirely different type of sort of cognition that's happening around this. Because, you know, I had roommates, I remember, who had been vegan and then who started eating meat. In one case, as a sort of ritualistic restarting of eating meat, he raised a pig and he slaughtered the pig himself. But I can assure you that that person would never have done that with a dog. And so the local argument, if we were locally producing dogs, would people eat them? No. And they don't try to arm themselves with arguments as to why eating dogs is bad for the environment or why it's bad for health. It's just not food. It's just somebody that we empathize with. And so that, I think, has been really lacking in a lot of the sort of pro-vegan argumentation. And I think that as an ideological minority, vegans have found it difficult to sort of do away with the way that the majority thinks. Like we move away from it a little bit, or quite a bit. You know, we move away from it in our habits. We say the majority eats meat and I'm not going to eat that. But we haven't fully internalized that by, you know, truly seeing these animals as not food. And so that's why, like, you know, I was talking about the difference between ideas around agroecology and regenerative grazing. You know, one of them is pro grains and beans and the other one isn't. And in fact, it's very different kinds of views, ways of seeing things. And so for me, as an organizer with Seed the Commons, I don't consider that I have enough knowledge at this point to be able to argue pro or con, you know, this idea that we shouldn't be growing cereals and legumes. I don't really know. I'm more interested in supporting building up platforms for farmers and generally moving away from industrial farming. And so I might have a farmer one day who's totally in agreement with that, but we need to move away from beans and, you know, legumes and grains, and somebody else who isn't in agreement with that. So my approach is more, I don't really know, but that's not really the point. The point is that regardless of whether A or B is better, maybe next year somebody's going to convince me that regenerative grazing is better and we shouldn't be having corn and beans, perhaps. But regardless of what it is, that should be in a vegan framework. And even if it's not obvious at the beginning how to do that, that should be in a vegan framework. And so I'm just going to take it as granted that farm animals should not be farm animals. We should not have that constructed category where there are these, you know, the small number of animals that for some reason we don't empathize with in the same way that we empathize with other animals. And so, yeah, so I think that that's the case sort of in broader society, but it is the case with vegans typically as well, where we just, it's not only that we don't empathize with them in the same way, but our whole sort of cognition around these issues is different with cows or with dogs. So if, you know, you and I were to have a discussion of like, well, you know, really local is the answer, you would start thinking, hamburger, but you wouldn't start thinking like that around other animals. And I think that really seeps into so many daily ways of thinking about food and farming and so on, and how we interact with others. So for me, that's been sort of my effort of how would I act if I really didn't consider these animals food, and how would I act if I really truly saw these animals the same as I see cats and dogs. And so with our forum, that's been sort of the thing. I think that people are pretty surprised when I say that when we did the forum, I always avoided having, I mean, this could go off into a tangent, which I'm not going to do, but I always avoided having a speaker who would be promoting veganism on an environmental or other basis, right? So we set out with veganism as our ethical framework. And that's it. And then we're talking about things like agroecology, but we're not really trying to argue, not that I don't think it's a good thing, but just for that specific context, we weren't trying to argue that veganism is the answer to environmental issues. And I think that regardless of what conference you go to, you could go to a conference, you know, on nuclear physics, but your lunch is not going to have certain animals' bodies on there. And so for us, it should be just as much of a given that all animals' bodies are not going to be there. And when vegans try to make veganism about everything, like veganism is better for social justice, and veganism is better because indigenous people did it or didn't do it or whatever, or veganism is better because you're going to be more fit and more thin. I think that it's also a reflection of the fact that as something that's not normative to care about these animals, it really stands out, and we have to find a way to sort of justify that instead of being strong within our own ideology and our own ethics.
Yeah, I think as well, it's interesting, like the concept of thinking of animals as food is just the way we grow up, because everybody around us is eating this, and then you're fed this from when you're a baby. So it's really kind of deeply ingrained. But what I find fascinating, and people can see with the other interviews that I've done, is how eating animals actually affects us biologically inside our own bodies. And the way that animal protein on its own acts like a toxin in the body. Now, it's been said that, we can handle a little bit of it, and animals can be like an emergency food source, but they're not the ideal because they do damage, and then you have to try to fix that. So it's interesting to see it in that way, because then you can see how it actually interacts when you ingest it, and if that is really food, or if this is just an emergency source of calories.
So, but I want to say that, people say like, oh, vegans don't see animals as food, and carnists or, mainstream society sees animals as food and so on. And I think that that's the way I think of this, and how I approach it in my work is that that's a misrepresentation of our disagreement and our differences. The mainstream does not see all animals as food. They only see certain animals as food.
Right.
And so I think that when we get into these conversations with people where we're trying to argue, like, should animals be food or not, and they say they are, we're sort of, our argument is kind of, it's not touching upon where the actual disagreement is.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're not really able to sort of speak reason, I guess, to the other side. Because we're allowing, basically, when something is normative, it's invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's not normative, it becomes visible. And
Right.
so the idea is that, vegans limit themselves. They have certain things that they don't eat, etc. Whereas other people eat everything. Like, that's a common, when I was growing up, it was always people were very proud to be like, well, I eat everything. I'm not fussy. I'm not, I'm not dogmatic. I eat everything. But I'm not an anthropologist, but I doubt that there are any cultures or many cultures where people eat everything. Everybody has limits on what they eat. And so in Western culture, we don't eat cats, we don't eat dogs, we don't eat most animals.
Mm-hmm.
So the argument of like, well, should we eat animals or not? It sometimes becomes unnecessarily, perhaps even philosophical, when if we actually point out that, no, the difference between me and you is that you don't eat cats and dogs and reptiles and so on, and you don't eat bears, and you don't eat cuddly koalas, and I don't eat those guys either for the same reasons as you, but I also don't eat cats and dogs. Also don't eat like cows and chickens and pigs. Now we're actually showing where the real difference is between us. And I think it's easier to talk about, not getting lost into these broader philosophical things, but really say, well, okay, now what is the difference between these animals? Because that's, in my opinion, there is no difference. And so I think that a carnist would have to show me where the difference is if they wanted to be able to convince me. Yeah. So
yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Yeah. So I would just like to mention that if anybody wants to, they can go to your website. It's www.seedthecommons.org, and I'm going to provide a link under the video. And I think you're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Is that right?
Yes, we don't update Instagram very much, but yes.
And do you have any upcoming projects or things that you're raising funds for? Anything you'd like to mention?
Yeah, so we're not very active with the event and sort of workshops and outreach around food politics generally and veganics. So we're taking a bit of a break with our forum precisely to raise some funds. We're focusing, however, on putting out more resources and more information. So one of our projects is building up interviews with veganic farmers and put out that sort of information, both for the general public, for vegans, and also for other farmers and environmentalists. So that's one area where people can both help us financially, but also participate as volunteers, help us out there. Building up the Veganic World resource. I think it's really important, as you mentioned, at this point to help transition towards a veganic food system. So it has to leave this niche of activists and really become a proposal that's more visible to the world.
Mhm.
And then another area where we active that we haven't spoken about so much now is that we're campaigning to get milk out of school meals in San Francisco. So
Ah, nice, nice. That should be a good fight. Yeah, I do know that the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine got legislation passed in California,
mhm.
um, so that every institution, I believe, but at least every hospital has to offer a whole food plant-based meal for their patients. And they also passed legislation that they won't sell products that have used animal testing on them. So last year, 2018, was a big year for uh, animal rights activists and also for the plant-based nutrition advocates in California.
Yeah.
So yeah, if anybody here in Newfoundland, if you do some veganic farming, I guess they can get in touch with you to share their story and let them know their successes and mistakes and things that they're working on, and to try to get in touch with other farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the website also veganic.world
Right.
where people can find farms, find, there's a map there. And ideally, we want to be able to not only restart the forum, but also create more opportunities for farmers to get out there and speak at conferences and so on, but also have more connections with each other and create educational resources for others that are starting or others that are transitioning. So these are all things that we want to be helping to build.
Yeah, well, I think the work you're doing is fantastic, and thank you for being here and to come onto the show and to let us know about all of this great information.
Thank you so much.
All right, you'll have a good rest of the day.